Have you ever wondered what it was like to be queer during the Roman Empire? There's nothing better to explain the entirety of it all than experiencing life back then. But we all know that's impossible. But you don't have to worry, because in this video, I will be talking about how tragic life was to be different from the norm. Imagine living in a highly militarized state that prefers to admire and uphold masculinity. While homosexuality was pretty normal in those days, that doesn't mean queer people had it better. It might not be a nightmare just like the present, but I'm sure it's not a walk in the park either. If you've ever heard stories about Hadrian and Antinous, Nisus and Euryalus, and other prominent names from ancient Rome, you'll realize that most of them ended up in a very tragic way, and today we will try and know why this happened. Welcome to Crazy Histories, where we bring you the craziest and weirdest facts from human history. Some of the things discussed in this video may be offensive or disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Roman society was patriarchal. History reveals that ancient Rome was a highly patriarchal society. Back in the day, men were inclined to live by the concept of virtus. Many of us have come across this term. However, for the Romans, it represented more than just virtue. For them, virtus is a deeper representation of Roman masculinity. Virtus is a Roman concept that carries the connotation of valor, manliness, and courage. This is also why Roman emperors were frequently regarded as personified deities. As early as ancient Rome, the term toxic masculinity could be used if we dug deeper into what virtus really meant. For Romans, this concept is the noblest of them all, and a man should live up to it if he possesses the finest qualities of manliness, courage, and superiority. This might be where the criticism of homosexual relationships started. However, there's a much deeper connection between this concept and homosexuality in ancient Rome. Virtus can also represent self-discipline. This involves power over oneself and power over others. In a way, masculinity can be determined by a man's ability to conquer another person. Of course, there's no gender restriction. Overpowering another male shows dominance. For Romans, being conquered or submissive equals weakness. Thus, being dominant is much preferred over the former. If we consider this, it will be easier to understand why, despite being outside the norm, the relationship between two males was not prohibited in ancient Rome. At most, it's a sign of power and dominance, the very essence of virtus and Rome's patriarchal society. Surprisingly, the Romans failed to create a specific word to call homosexuality. For an empire full of writers and poets, Rome ignored the cloud and decided that naming this sexual preference was unnecessary. This is mainly because, back in the day, gender didn't play a role in picking partners. What determines whether a person is acceptable to another is their social status. So whether a man decides to be with a man or a woman, it doesn't matter as long as their social status makes up for it. Roman men's homosexuality. Despite the concept of virtus and Rome's pursuit to uphold masculinity, men weren't prohibited from having sexual relationships with other men. In fact, records show that Roman men were free to seek the company of another man without any consequences. It was even revealed that preference for a person of the same gender does not affect their masculinity or social status. However, there's a catch. They should always take the dominant role to uphold their dignity and masculine trait. This is where the stigma comes in. Remember when I mentioned how there was no Latin word to describe homosexuality back then? It is because the Romans decided that it was better to establish stereotypes. Because of this, partners are identified based on their roles in the relationship. They can either be the masculine one or the person who holds dominance over the other, and the weaker one is known as the submissive one. And since Rome was patriarchal and an obvious military state, males were allowed to engage with anyone, but there was a catch. Acceptable male partners are slaves, prostitutes, or entertainers. Anyone with a lower social class is preferred because they are expected to take on the submissive role. Because of this, males aged from 12 to 20 years old are the easiest targets, and you can only imagine how that went. In the early stages of homosexual awakening in Rome, social status is very important. While men were given the liberty to choose their partners, freeborn men and young boys from the higher part of the social ladder were strictly off limits. Compared to boys born with no dignified social backgrounds, the younger males of noble families are protected from harassment from older men. This clearly explains why homosexual relationships were more inclined toward the satisfaction of a person's desire, and how social status was used as a tool to demonstrate dominance rather than love and adoration. There might be a few prominent figures from ancient Rome who decided to abolish this stereotype by falling in love for real. But one thing is for sure, love was never the foundation of homosexuality in ancient Rome. Relationship between women. Unlike its male counterpart, information when it comes to the relationship between Roman women is scarce. Historians were sure that this happened, but the Romans either forgot to write about it or deemed it insignificant to record. Nevertheless, the relationship between the two women was viewed in a different light. This is mainly because labels such as masculine and dominance do not align with how Roman men saw women back in the day. It didn't help that in ancient Rome, it was considered taboo for a woman to take an active role in a sexual relationship. Records even show that such a thing was unheard of, and Roman society was not ready to see women in that kind of relationship with each other. Historians also recorded some horrifying incidents involving husbands killing their wives as a result of these affairs. Social stigma played a big role in this. Roman women are expected to marry and produce offspring. That's how society labeled them, and since infant mortality was severely high during those times, so the distaste and prejudice that followed women who were engaged in a relationship with another woman were natural, since this would not allow them to fulfill their duty to conceive children. To give you more context about what it felt like to love another woman in ancient Rome, Seneca the Younger, a Roman philosopher who lived from 4 BC to 65 CE, reflects the conventional wisdom on the subject of female same-sex attraction. In one of his epistles, she discusses the topic and argues that women who have abandoned their womanly nature or their passivity have transformed into males in terms of physiological function and are hence condemned to endure illnesses associated with men. This can be related to the concept of virtus, or the Romans' adoration of their dominance and masculinity. Seeing a woman take on the role of dominant is more than a monstrosity. It is an act of offense to their dominance, which cannot be tolerated. Homosexuality and Christianity. While homosexual relationships were not prohibited, things changed when Christianity was introduced in ancient Rome. Before this, Roman religion was vastly polytheistic. As a result, their attitude toward homosexual relationships was influenced by the Greek gods, who openly engaged in sexual relationships with both gods and mortals without much regard for whether they were both male or female. Because of this, the record shows that no law prohibited such, and there was great tolerance when it came to homosexuality and other sexual expressions without any restriction as to gender. Same-sex marriage was legal. Unlike today, there was no prohibition or repression of same-sex unions, and any kind of restriction was absent in ancient Rome. But everything changed when Christianity was introduced in ancient Rome. Unlike the prior polytheistic religion that embraced gods who were allowed to express their desire for a person of any gender, Christianity is a purely monotheistic faith that worships a single transcendent deity who is somewhat similar to the Hebrew deity Yahweh. The one and only Christian God do not reproduce or engage in sexual relations. Because of this, the rejection of any form of homosexuality can be related to the growth of Christianity in the empire. Eskridge furthers this idea in A History of Same-Sex Marriage, where he explains that the early church fathers, most notably Clement, Jerome, Origen, and Augustine, developed a philosophy of sexual abstinence that problematized any sexual activity done for pleasure itself. At the beginning of the 3rd century, Emperor Philip the Arab started banning male prostitution. From there, more changes were introduced to successfully erase any trace of homosexuality in the state. Laws that banned gay marriage and other rules that would condemn any acts related to it were passed. While it is true that Christianity was not the sole cause of the sudden stigma against this type of relationship, it is important to note that religious teachings triggered hostile behavior toward queer and homosexuals to some extent. Acceptance of members of the community has dramatically evolved, and while it's certain that we can't compare how same-sex relationships were perceived way back in ancient Rome with how we work to accept anything outside the norm today, to some degree, the process of learning to entertain the possibility that people can love despite their gender is still steep and has a long way to go, just like how the Romans tried to understand and make something out of it. We hope you liked the video and hit the like and subscribe buttons. Make sure to enable post notifications and share your thoughts on this strange love story in the comments section. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.